Good afternoon, everyone. Is the sound okay? Am I too close to my mic? No? Okay. Welcome, everyone. We're going to start this event just now so that we have time for fruitful discussion. So this event is called Climate Finance at COP29, State of Play of Negotiation and Myth Busting. So hopefully you're in the right room, ready to listen to that. So as you all know, of course, the NCQG is the make or break issue at COP29. So we really wanted to take time after this first week of negotiation to ensure that we have a clear understanding of the state of play of the negotiation, what did happen, what did not happen, and then debunk together the different arguments, the different myths we've been hearing, not only here in Baku, right, but since actually the negotiation started almost 3 years ago, and really to try to together understand those arguments, find counter arguments, and really recenter maybe the key priority we see as civil society for the next steps of the negotiation, looking towards week 2 and the ministerial phase. So we're going to structure the event in 3 phases. I will quickly give you a readout of the state of play, what happened this week and where we at with the text, the negotiation, etc. Then we're going to take a bigger perspective and understand a bit what is at stake when we speak about climate finance, what are the deepest politics behind that topic with our 4 amazing panelists. And then we're going to talk you through a series of myths that we've been hearing over and over again and that we feel is really important to collectively debunk. And then we're going to have a moment for question and answer with you. So it's going to be kind of an informal, interactive conversation, so feel free to note down your question and we'll make sure we have some time to address those. Okay, there are no stupid questions. I think it's important. Finance always look very complex and technical, but it's actually very political and everybody needs to be able to support the discussion and engage. Sounds good? Yeah? Okay, cool. So before I start to delve a bit more in the details, I will just quickly introduce the amazing panel we have with us today. So on my left, we have Harjit Singh, who is the Global Engagement Director at the Fossil Fuel Treaty Initiative. Then we have Dr. Maria Ron Barcera, Executive Director at the Center for Economic and Social Rights. Teresa Anderson, who is the Global Lead on Climate Justice for ActionAid International. And Mariana Paoli, who is Global Advocacy Lead at ChristianAid. And sorry, my name is Rebecca Thyssen, and I work at CAN International as Global Advocacy Lead, and I'll be your moderator today. So, I mean, we could not, yeah?
Can we just do a sound check? How do people find the sound? Is it audible? It's okay?
Do I sound horrible to you?
From here,
it's loud for us. Is it good for you, though? Yeah? Okay. Okay, good. So we could not dream of a better panel, I think, today to have this conversation. So I'm really happy to have those people with us today. So just bringing us back maybe a few steps before coming to COP. So you remember that the NCQG negotiation have been going on for 3 years. So we have had 15 technical dialogues. We have had different high-level ministerial, I think now 6, 7. We had a pre-COP right before COP that happened here in Baku, focusing specifically on the NCQG. So this discussion has been going on for months and years, but yet we feel that we are still very far from being close to an equitable and a fair deal. So what happened here in Baku? So you know that there is a pair of co-chairs facilitating the technical negotiations, so from South Africa and Australia. And before COP, I think it was around the 15th of October, they issued what is called a substantive framework for a decision text. That was kind of 12 page long. So then parties were meant to read that text and decide whether they were ready to engage or not when we were meant to arrive at COP. So we had the first session, the first contact group on NCQG, I believe on Tuesday. I'm a bit lost in time, that's what COP does to you, but let's say very early in the week. And quite directly, the G77 decided to not engage with the text because they really felt that it was unbalanced and not reflecting their position adequately. So they came with a very robust intervention that probably necessitated a lot of coordination, stating approximately 12 key issues that they needed to see in order to be able to engage with the new text. One of the interesting things that came out of this intervention is that the G77 agreed on a quantum. If you've been following the different submissions before, you know that some subgroups of the G77 proposed through their submission some quantum. So we had a 1.1 trillion proposed by the Arab group, 1.3 trillion in the AGN submission, and so on. But there was no collective quantified ask from the G77, and so now they all agree together to claim a 1.3 trillion as a quantum for the NCQG. They also had very clear ask around grants, and the quality of the finance needed to be predictable, adequate, additional, the role of public finance, and the need to integrate loss and damage in the text. So from there, negotiation kind of stopped because it was clear that we could not engage with the text, and so the co-chair were tasked to produce a new starting point, right? A new framework for decision. It's important to know that it's not yet a decision text. It's a framework for decision, which is legally different. And so they came back, I think, the following night, on the same day on the evening, with a new text that was 34 pages long. So of course, it was way longer, very hard to read. There was no structure in the text anymore. You know, usually you have subtitles that kind of cluster the different issue, and there they decided to really start from scratch without any clear structure. But the good thing about it is now that the different options are much more granular, and so we can really see some good and substantive option being reflected, and of course on the other side we also see very bad option being reflected. So parties very quickly reacted, said it's still too long, we can't work with this, so we ask you to streamline. So co-chair did streamline and put the text a page less, so we are now at 33. That's how we get excited about COP. And so they decided on a interesting process, let's say. So parties agreed to work on specific aspects of the text through informal. So you know, it's the moment where the rooms get closed. And so they agreed to discuss access, transparency, and these enablers. So the three sections, probably because they saw maybe more convergences in those specific sections. And so they agreed to have a discussion that was not led by the co-chairs, but by parties only. So they appointed two members to manage the discussion, but co-chair were not in the room. So that was closed to observer. And then co-chair were in parallel working on the rest of the text to synthesize it. That's where we were yesterday. We were told that they were continuing the informal today, but actually nothing happened. So I think everybody realized it's a bit complicated to work on specific aspect of the text while not have any view of how the text is evolving on the other pieces, knowing also that, of course, there is a certain amount of things that you can discuss, but when you know that the political question, the critical question are not being discussed nor addressed and far from being agreed, whether it's the quantum, the contributor base, we're going to discuss about that, it's actually very hard to move forward, right? You can agree maybe on specific access feature, but you know that you're going to be very soon blocked by the rest of the package. So we are in kind of that bit vague and opaque situation. So we are meant now to have another session of informals. Co-chair are meant to produce a text by 5 p.m. I hope you're all not going to leave to read that text and stay with us when it goes out. But so yeah, we're going to hear from parties the next steps and what kind of new paper we're going to see, knowing that the presidency has said that by tomorrow at 10, we will need to close the technical negotiation. We do believe that's very short because we're still with 33 pages for now. So we will encourage everyone to push for more time and ensure that ministers next week receive something that can be actually discussed. And final word on where we are. So just you know that next week we start on the ministerial phase. So minister will take over the negotiation. So it's a very different type of conversation. So it's we have a ministerial pair from Egypt, Minister Fouad, and Australia, Minister Brownen, who will lead and facilitate the discussion. And we know that the vast majority of political issues are still very much at stake, whether again, quantum, contributor base, the structure of the goal, etc. So it's going to be very intense I believe, and complicated discussion, and so it's important that we are all understanding what needs to happen then. With that little long introduction, I will give the floor to our panelists to give us maybe, again, take a step back and understand a bit why we need climate finance and how the goal needs to be structured and how the goal needs to look like by the end of next week. So Teresa, maybe starting with you.
Yeah, thank you, Rebecca. That was actually a very succinct description of what's been happening slowly this week, so much appreciated. But someone is going to have to pay the cost of the climate crisis. The question is who? Will it be the countries that cause the crisis or the countries that suffer its impacts? Because developed countries are the ones that have caused the crisis. They're the ones that have been polluting for a century or more, and those emissions released every decade since that start are still up there heating the planet today. And yet it's frontline countries who have done almost nothing to cause the problem, who are being pushed deeper into debt by the climate crisis. They're the ones paying year after year to recover from floods, droughts, cyclones, rising sea levels, desertification, and more. This year alone, Bangladesh suffered four major destructive cyclones, as well as catastrophic floods. The most severe crisis, drought crisis in 100 years, means Malawi, Zambia, and Zimbabwe are currently in a deepening hunger crisis. Floods in East Africa earlier this year affected 1.6 million people. And so we see clearly the global south is being pushed deeper into poverty by climate impacts caused by others. And yet somehow, on top of all of this, the global south is also expected to adapt to future impacts and to also pay for scaling up its renewable energy and green technologies to cut emissions. So that is just simply not realistic without climate finance. Because sticking the global south with an escalating climate bill is not only unfair, it is a recipe for certain planetary breakdown. That is why climate hit countries desperately need COP29 to agree a new climate finance goal that delivers real money worth trillions of dollars in grants each year. So I'll just finish it there for now.
Thank you very much. Harjit, do you want to build on that?
Sure, I can just build on that. The reality is that we are already facing disasters which are costing us hundreds of billions of dollars annually. And as per the report in 2023, the costs are to the tune of $16 million per hour. And there was also a report just a few days ago, which actually updates that number, which goes to now 2 trillion, which means even this number is going to go up. So very clearly, we are seeing how costs are escalating. And I must also mention that majority of these costs only focus on extreme weather events. If you look at the range of slow onset events, the way seas are rising, the way glaciers are melting, and we are seeing desertification, those costs are not included. So what we find is an underestimation of the costs that we are incurring from loss and damage. And yet this process is not really taking all that into account, as Rebecca already mentioned, how there's going to be a challenging conversation on including loss and damage in NCQG. As Teresa mentioned, communities are paying the cost. And I remember there was a study in Bangladesh which said it's only 3% of the cost that is being covered by the international system. It's largely communities or the domestic sources, which means governments that are poor, they're spending the scarce resources now on emergency response and rehabilitation. So which means that it's going to delay their development much more, and all the disasters are eroding the development gains of the past. And I must also connect that with the transitioning away from fossil fuels. The world must realize that how meeting the cost of loss and damage is going to be extremely important if we really want to see climate action throughout, because if a community is facing disasters and losing its home, you can't expect that community or a country to talk about solar panels and wind farms, because most of their resources are going in recovering from climate impacts, let alone leaving aside some money for adaptation. So our sequencing has changed. In 1990s, we started talking about mitigation and then adaptation and loss and damage. Unfortunately, we have reached a point where we have to first talk about addressing loss and damage, because that's the reality developing countries are facing. And then, of course, we need to make sure that they have resources also to adapt to future impacts. Only then they'll be able to do mitigation. So that realization is still not there. And we are already facing a massive debt crisis. If you look at several reports, in 2021, there was a report which said that half of the low-income countries are already facing debt crisis or at risk. A report from, yeah. So V20 countries said, I'm talking of low-income countries. Yeah. V20 countries said that they're paying 4 times more debt servicing than rich countries in the world. So the reality is that the burden is much more on developing countries, on low-income countries, and that's where loss and damage is making things far worse. And among them, countries who are depending on fossil fuels or even producer countries, the reality is they are going to continue to extract fossil fuels, and it's going to make their transition much harder. And we are already seeing countries like Colombia, Ecuador, Pakistan, Timor-Leste, and others who will, I'm sure Bolivia, which is facing that crisis, is going to continue to extract. So how one thing is linked to the other, I think that's an important thing to understand. The entire range of climate action and finance is needed.
Thank you very much for those points. Maria, do you want to add some elements?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. The current climate crisis is the direct result of the unequal global economic structure that flourished in colonial times through the extractivism which disproportionately benefit the global north, causing environmental degradation to the south. And that is why climate finance is not charity. Climate finance is not an opportunity to make profit. Climate finance is a right. And the global north have the obligation, okay, underline obligation, to provide climate finance because they are the duty bearers, okay? So they have to stop shying away and making up excuses and delays and just trying to come up with like multi-layer approaches, and the private sector needs to be doing this, and then we need to be like burdening the global south even more through loans and exacerbating the debt crisis. We know that currently climate finance is not really working under this framework. And that's why we really need this human rights angle. We really need reparations. And we really need the global north to be meeting their commitments, to be meeting these obligations, and really to stop with this inadequate, insufficient climate finance that they are not really giving away, obviously, but they are just like burdening the global south, as we have been hearing, because currently the global south is subsidizing the global north in the climate finance. They are paying the bill. And guess what? The global north is actually profiting from it. So enough is enough, and there is enough money to really meet these commitments. So we really need a quantum ASAP. Stop shying away from your responsibility. Thank you.
Indeed. Thank you for that. Mariana?
Thank you. I guess I just wanted to then, hearing all these considerations, how can we bring this back to how that's reflected in the negotiations, especially when we look at this process. I mean, it started in 2022, so there have been at least 3 years of negotiation around the new goal, and 11 TED, 6 high-level ministerial meetings, and to some extent, what we have seen is a big refusal of developed countries to fulfill their commitments under the Paris and the Convention, because we know that this new goal, the NCQG, is very much framed into around the Article 9 and the responsibilities of developed countries to deliver. So what we have seen, instead of providing what they're meant to do, which is essentially public grants-based finance at scale, new and additional to ODA, predictable, etc., is every single excuse to actually include for other solutions that it doesn't really affect their budgets much. And that's where, for example, all the conversation about attracting private sector to deliver comes into place. So not only through the mantra around mobilizing private sector, creating bankable projects, and leveraging, de-risking, providing guarantees for activities that, in fact, we know are not profitable. So when we look at the text today, there is still a lot of the good elements we want to see, but there's still a lot of this narrative being overplayed. And the big risk that we have is, instead of having a new goal that is actually embedded in that justice, equity, reparations about, from developed to developing countries, we risk locking the new goal into making developing countries to be blamed for not fundraising, not attracting enough investment for the years to come. Because if the whole conversation, because the developed countries, they have not provided a quantum yet. We have seen so many proposals that have been in terms of from developing countries. But if we arrive here next week in a big quantum without any of the quality grants-based public finance, we're going to lock in the conversation into how we're going to attract the private sector instead of the responsibility of developed countries to deliver. When we know that private finance is limited for mitigation, it's inadequate for adaptation, and it's completely meaningless for loss and damage. So we need to bring back that piece of narrative. And to do that, it's really important to debunk a number of myths we're seeing throughout the negotiation, which are reflected on the text in a number of false solutions. And I guess that's the subject of the next conversation.
Thank you very much to all of you for that scene setting. So indeed, we really hear that it's a matter of obligation, responsibility. As Teresa said, someone has to pay. It's clear, it's legally set in the Paris Agreement. On another hand, the costs are rising on every area of climate action, whether it's about mitigation, reducing emission, phasing off fossil fuels, building adaptation and resilience, or of course addressing loss and damage. But also, if we take a bit maybe a more macro and meta approach, we know that the NCQG and this conversation that we have here is also fitting within a wider economic system that is actually unfair and not working for people, nor the planet. So I think it's also important to connect those dots. And of course, this is all happening in the context of a wider climate debt. And that's what I think is leading our conversation today. So now that you have the scene clear, let's dive a bit more specifically into the different assumption arguments we've been hearing over and over. So we've tried to map those for you to have a kind of a clear understanding, and then be able to counter those if you wish, and at least know how to debunk those myths. So let's start maybe with the oldest one, the one that's looking a bit backwards and looking at the previous climate finance goal. You know that the previous climate finance goal is also called the 100 billion goal that was established in Copenhagen and anchored in the Paris Agreement. So meant to reach 100 billion from developed to developing countries every year between 2020 and 2025. And recently, we heard that developed countries have actually met that goal in 2022. And we've been hearing, not only this year, but also in the past, that they were on track to meet that goal and that they were actually doing a good job. So I'd like to hear from you, Mariana. What can we answer to that? And is this goal, actually, this 100 billion goal, fit for purpose? And do we actually really believe that developed countries have been meeting their obligation when it comes to climate finance?
Well, I guess we have to remember that that claim was made by the OECD, but the methodology is widely disputed. We have the Oxfam's shadow report that have really mentioned that in fact, that sum was overstated and the true value of the climate finance is up to 88 billion. Now, we also know that in fact, the amount, the true value of the actual like significant funds provided has been more between 28 and 35 billions out of that. So the goal not only was not achieved in 2020, but there were also like counting the shortfalls, which in 2020 was 16.7 and in 2021 10.4 billion. So looking at the Oxfam methodology, so there has been not just short, but also when we look at the quality of that, most of it were provided in the form of loans and even like commercial rate loans. So the issue of the quality of the finance is really important, and of course most of that went to mitigation and not to adaptation. About this, if we look at this number, also 92% of the public one was not really new and additional to ODA. So a lot of that, the grants-based stuff actually came from the ODA pot. So for this reason, using the 100 billion goal, which was actually, it's not needs-based, we know it was a political goal to begin with. So yeah, insufficient, not needs-based, and politically set. The quality also insufficient. So yeah, for this reason, completely debunked.
Thanks. So I guess we have a lot of lesson to learn from that previous goal to actually make sure the NCQG is fit for purpose. And so let's try to course correct in the discussion now at COP. So the following myth we've been hearing over and over, and actually Mariana alluded to it as well, is the role of loans in climate finance. So as she said, 70% of the climate finance provided in 2022 was actually in the form of loans, and sometimes loans with high interest rate. So Teresa, is that actually matching the climate justice and this different equity principle we see in the convention and the Paris Agreement?
Well, I mean, we know that developed countries want to keep their grant-based contributions minimal and then claim that private finance can fill the gap. So they're pushing loans. They're also pushing other finance flows that Mariana is going to speak about. But all of these other finance flows can actually do quite a lot of harm if, so. But I'll talk about loans for now. Loans aren't climate finance and should not be classed, or should not anyway be classed as climate finance, because Harjeet started touching on this and I was like, actually, I have some other numbers to add to Harjeet's point, which is 97% of climate vulnerable countries are in or at risk of debt distress. And that's not a coincidence, right? Because the climate crisis is pushing countries into debt distress with all the cost of recovering every time there's a disaster, year after year, and then losing the income that you would normally have to repay your, for your economy, and then any debt repayment opportunities, but also debt distress and the austerity that is then imposed when a country goes into debt distress means that it is virtually impossible for those countries to invest in climate action. They just don't have the resources to invest in adaptation, let alone mitigation. They're not even managing to pay for the loss and, recovering from loss and damage. So this debt distress makes them more vulnerable to climate change. And that's why loans should never be, as a start, climate finance. And you can't pretend that loans are helping countries on the front lines of the climate crisis. But it gets worse because loans actually worsen the climate crisis. Because when countries are pushed to, required to repay their loans, they end up having to, how are they supposed to earn foreign money? How are they supposed to earn dollars? To repay those loans? Usually the only way they can do that is through climate destructive industries. So they do it through fossil fuels, and they do it through expanding their fossil fuels and expanding their industrial agriculture. So, so loans actually worsen the climate crisis. So classing loans as climate finance not only worsens the climate crisis, it also worsens people's vulnerability. We see how public finance is actually being used to leverage more loans. you know, a lot of the money that is even now being classed as public finance isn't actually going directly to people. It's actually going to raise these, you know, concessional loans. If, for, you know, simply put, if I put $10 into a bank, they can then give $100 worth of loans. So that $10 originally is public finance. And so a lot of public finance is actually just being led to more loans anyway. And so even eating into the actual grant-based money that is going to help communities on the front lines of the climate crisis. And so we're seeing loans that are public loans, sometimes concessional, but also high interest loans, also private loans. You know, banks are giving loans. So, you know, this is not real money. They're taking our money. And instead, we need to see real grants, because we can see how much harm loans do. So it has to be grant-based money. You can only really do good money with grants. For example, if you want to do a just transition in the, you know, move away from fossil fuels to industrial agriculture, it's not just that the private sector can't just do that. You know, you can't just replace a technology and expect that to work. You have to pay for, you know, including communities in the planning. You have to pay for training, reskilling, social protection. All of these, you have to pay to sort of scale down and compensate the, you know, perhaps, or, you know, deal with the fossil industry. That is something that only governments can do with grants. Private industry cannot do that on their own back. So that's why you just simply cannot rely on the private sector to fill the gap. And so that's why we need the goal to deliver trillions of dollars each year in grant-based finance. Yeah.
Thank you very much for that. And I guess another ask we have been very clear with is, of course, we need grants at the core of the goal, but also the way you report climate finance is very important, because as Mariana was alluding to, the way OECD countries have been reporting the climate finance is whether it's loans or not, it's always reported at face value. So of course, it ends up with very supposedly big numbers, but when you look at the grant components, of course, a total different reality. So it's very important to ensure that the grant component comes in the transparency arrangement as well. Maria, coming to you now. Also a very classic myth we've been hearing over and over from majority developed countries, of course, is that actually there is not enough public money. We can't really afford that new climate finance goal, right? The budgets are constrained, there is a liquidity squeeze, but what can we answer to that, quite frankly?
Rebecca, yeah, there is not enough public money, poor them, right? But there is enough public money to invest in militarization. It's like military expenditure is like $2.43 trillion per year. There is enough money to give subsidies to fossil fuels at around $7 trillion per year. So there is enough money for that, right? But when we are talking about public grant-based financing to fill the $1.3 trillion that has to be per year, right, as part of the core financing for the NCQG, where is this money going to be coming from? I have plenty of solutions. And most of them, guess what? They actually align with human rights. And this has to do with tax justice and debt justice. So if we start taxing windfall profits, and you will remember that in COVID times, how, like, you know, multinational corporations from pharmacy, also the energy corporations that in COVID, but particularly that in the Ukraine crisis, they have been making extraordinary profits, right? They're paying very, very little. And this actually works against, like, what's supposed to be the economy orthodoxy. So this actually works badly for the market. And if we were to tax them at 90%, we will be reaching 941 billion per year, just in 2021. Another way of, like, raising this revenue would be by taxing wealth, and particularly taxing the super rich. And this has taken a lot of momentum, and particularly in the G20. This is being sponsored also from Brazil. Gabriel Zuckman has been talking about it. And just taxing only 2%, the 2% super rich people, right? That would be raising 250 billion. I personally think that that's not enough. I think that we should be taxing the 1 or 2% of the richest per country, and we should be taxing them at at least 8% to actually get redistribution. Other taxes have to do with the green taxes, such as polluter pay, but this shouldn't be falling on those on the global south. This also has to do with historical pollution, and also taxing aviation, shipping taxes. But please, let me just say a little thing, because this global task force, it has taken the headlines, but it is a big, big distraction. This could be part of it, but this is not the only thing. The real money is in changing where the tax rules are being made. At the moment, they are being made at the OECD, and this is the club of rich nations with the gentleman agreement and all that. And guess what? All these rules are really benefiting the global north. Again, at the expense of the global south. It is due time to have these tax rules being negotiated at the UN. And that's why it is so important for all of us to be supporting the UN tax convention. Same thing happens in debt restructuring negotiations. At the moment, these are being done bilaterally, and the global south is getting really, really poor deals. So this, again, needs to happen at the UN, right? And we really need a framework convention to be negotiating this. And another way, that rather than using public money for guarantees for the risking in order to attract better loans, what we really need to do is to move, as I said, the debt restructuring to the UN, not to the IMF, not to the World Bank, that they are not really working for us. We really need to have independent credit rating agencies that are really, really racist, and they are making lots of money by giving really poor deals to the global south that are paying huge amounts of money, right? A lot sooner, a lot earlier than the global north countries that also have debt, but paying much lower rates. And they also need to be lending in local currency, right? So all of these are part of this magic money tree. There is enough money there. We don't really need private financing that, as Teresa said, is only getting exacerbating the climate crisis. And no more loans, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maria. So I guess, yes, pursuing tax justice, redirecting harmful subsidies, there are many avenues developed countries can follow and implement to actually raise the trillions we need. And then, of course, there's a question of how to reform the wider financial architecture to also free up money and make it also more fair and equitable. So linked to that question of, or that myth of there is not enough public money, we need to find new sources, etc. A new proposal has been trending a bit in the negotiation recently, and it's the idea that we need a multi-layer investment goal. Or let's say an investment goal or a multi-layer goal, depends a bit on who you talk to, whether it's the US, Switzerland, the EU. But overall, developed countries have suggested to add a layer to the NCQG to bring other sources, other channels, other contributors in, entering their paradigm that there is not enough public money, so we need others to step in. So Mariana, please help us to understand what this proposal is about and what should we be answering to it.
And also explain, is like a double Mac, triple Mac burger or something with multi-layers? So.
Good question. Yeah, that sounds to be quite trending at the moment. And it's just one of those things that there is different meanings to this new thing that appeared in the negotiations. And that's because, well, let's start from the beginning. The word investment is not really part of the Paris Agreement and the convention. What we're talking here is the money that should be mobilized and provided. Now, the multi-layer approach comes in the conversation linked to the excuse that there's not enough public money available, therefore we need to create these extra layers on to deliver the climate finance. Now, there are different understandings. There was a US proposal, which essentially was to put everything under the sun, even like north-north flows, domestic, national climate finance, everything counts. And well, given there's not really clear definition anyway, amazing. You're going to reach like huge numbers of all sorts of investments to count. There was also an European proposal from Switzerland. Well, maybe we should create all these investments and, maybe something secured more for developing countries. The truth of the matter is that all those excuses are in fact trying to limit or justify the very little amount of public finance and perhaps use the little amount of public finance to mobilize, to attract private finance. So essentially is the whole leveraging, de-risking, the guarantees that we're talking about as one of the layers with that investment layer on the side. Well, actually, if there were to be any multi-layers in these NCQG, we're only talking about, two approaches. We're talking about a core, the bulk really of the NCQG being that grants-based public finance, and then with the outer layer with some kind of mobilization. If there were to be layers, this was the ones meant to be. And in fact, if you really want to be specific, put actually specific targets for loss and damage, for adaptation, for mitigation, for grants-based finance. If we really want to go into detail, this is the right level to go. So the multi-layer is a distraction. It was not part of the negotiations. Investments are not part of the Paris Agreement, and it just removes the attention out of that public core grants that needs to be delivered.
Thank you, Mariana. Indeed, the word investment is nowhere to be found in the Paris Agreement, and the NCQG's mandate is coming from Article 9, which speaks about mobilization and provision. So I think it's very important to go back to the basics and the scope we need to be discussing. So the structure of the goal is a very polemic topic. So we heard about the different layers, the burger, the McDonald's, but they also what are we talking about and what are we going to include in this goal? And there, surprisingly, maybe because we know how loss and damage is a critical priority, even though we don't see this as a yet politically agreed priorities for developed countries, and they've been silently opposing, let's say, the idea of including loss and damage within the new goal as a specific sub-goal, while it's a clear priority for developing countries. So Harjit, why is it so, and what can we say about it?
Thank you, Rebecca. Before I answer that question, I should mention that how privileged I am right now feeling sitting among these amazing women leaders, and I'm learning a lot. What I learned that all those extra layers of cheese and meat are neither good for your health, and those layers of finance are not good for the planet, right? And for people. So that's what I have learned today.
Glad you came.
Okay, so on the myth sub-goal. So let me tell you from where it originates, because developed countries are making an argument because this particular goal or the discussion on this goal was agreed as part of Paris Agreement. And that time, the challenge and struggle we had to even get loss and damage in the Paris Agreement itself. We fought for it. We got Article 8. So they're saying, oh, it's not mentioned. It only talks about mitigation and adaptation. I think this is where we need to remind them that we have been fighting for loss and damage for 30 years. We knew that it's going to become the third pillar. Island nations were already seeing that reality way back in early 1990s. It was, again, developed countries who did not agree. And over the years, we have seen how it is a real third pillar, because you cannot just talk about mitigation and adaptation, how we have locked the emissions in the system. And that's where it is really important for us to look at finance also responding to that third pillar, which has become a reality. And this is a moment to recognize it. And the legal argument falls flat because it's the failure of mitigation and adaptation which has led to loss and damage. And even if you read the convention, it talks about responding to the adverse effects of climate change. Adverse effects is this, loss and damage. So there is no argument not to include loss and damage in this. And of course, there's now, over the years, we've also talked about meeting the evolving needs. When you say evolving need is now helping people recover from climate impacts, and that's loss and damage. So we are demanding that we need to have a sub-goal, and that sub-goal should have clear earmarking of money to the tune of $400 billion annually. Also recognizing that markets are not going to pay for loss and damage. Even for adaptation, markets have failed because it's a public good. The kind of activities you need to undertake, and I see Farah sitting here from Bangladesh, I see our friends from Bolivia and other developing countries. Who is providing money to poor communities to recover their homes and rebuild and do retrofitting or build dikes or rebuild their homes? All that is part of public good. You talk about adaptation or loss and damage. So we need to make sure that there's a separate goal for loss and damage and there's a clear earmarking of money that is absolutely needed.
Thank you very much. And also let's all remember that parties agreed 2 years ago to establish a fund for loss and damage, and it's better that it not remain empty, right? Politically, it's, I think, quite important too. Thanks. So are you all still good with all the myths? I know we're feeding you with a lot of information, but just to recap where we are now. So we spoke about the 100 billion goal being met, but we know that the goal was not fit for purpose. We are talking about the role of loans in climate finance. The fact that there is not enough public money. I guess now you understood that there is enough public money by far. This idea of a multi-layer goal and all the risk that it encompasses, and now the blocking, the blockages we've seen around the sub-goal on loss and damage. That's where we are. Moving to the next myth. So another thing that we've been observing, and it's not actually only in the context of the NCQG, it was already a reality in the context of the previous climate goal, so the 100 billion goal, is the role of multilateral development banks, so the famous MDBs, that are now being pushed more and more to be the new channels for climate finance. However, those institutions are far from being democratic. They are banks, basically. So banks comes with loans. And we have actually established UNFCCC climate funds that exist. So Mariana, I've been keen to hear your views about that trend of pushing MDBs as the new silver bullet for climate finance, and what should we be answering to that?
Yeah, I guess maybe some of you might have heard, but the new mantra of the World Bank is to become a bigger and a better bank and building lives on a livable planet. Well, livable should be a dignified planet, not just something we can live with. But what really is striking is that essentially climate finance has been the way of MDBs to reclaim their role in the economic financial architecture. And probably you might have heard a lot of that the global economic architecture is not fit for purpose. Well, to many, some of that means we need the multilateral development banks to play a bigger role in climate finance. But the main problem with that is essentially the way they work is not delivering for the poorest. First, because we know that they provide most of their funding on loans, and we heard from Teresa a number of problems linked to that. And those loans are many times provided with conditionalities, trying to force developing countries to create those enabling environments, fiscal consolidations. We know 85% of the population in the world is already living under some kind of austerity measures. And, the IMF, MDBFIs play a role in driving this kind of regressive policies. The second one is that we know how much those institutions, they lack transparency, accountability, and inclusion, and really do not respect human rights-based approach. The third one, we're going to put in their hands providing climate finance when they're still funding a lot of fossil fuels, billions and billions of fossil fuels. And the last point, if there are institutions where the Global South has very little voice and participation. We have the gentleman's agreement between the bank and the fund, and the majority of the shareholders in the hands of the Global North. So these are the ones who will be dictating how much, who gets it, and under what conditions. And this is exactly the opposite of the justice that we have. All climate finance should be guided through UN-based institutions where actually developing countries have one vote and one voice is more equal. So no, and unless they really change drastically, they have no role to play, no bigger role to play. in climate finance.
Thank you. So I think that's also a very important argument to have clear, because we're going to see those propositions rising next week when ministers arrive, and they're going to look for a solution to find more money. So it's undemocratic, a lot of loans, still investing in fossil fuels, right? Lack of transparency. So those institutions are not yet fit for purpose to get a bigger role in climate finance. Thank you for that, Mariana. Another very important point, and I think when we realize that we are in 2024 and we still don't have that conversation clear, it's a bit absurd, but it's true. We still don't have a clear definition of what climate finance is, right? While it's 15 years that we agree that we're going to speak about climate finance, it has been recognized as one of the pillars of the Paris Agreement, although nothing has been defined. However, some developed countries, actually the vast majority of them, are very comfortable with that kind of vagueness and opacity. We don't need a definition of climate finance. Let's all have our own definition. And so it ends up counting loans, carbon markets, ice cream shops, in some projects. So it's very interesting consequences on the ground. So I'll be interesting, Teresa, to see a bit your views about that and what can we answer to developed countries who do not want that definition to be clearer.
It's great. No, clearly we cannot have climate finance, including loans that push countries deeper into debt. And the only way that they can repay those loans is by expanding their fossil fuels. Clearly, we can't have money flows that worsen the climate crisis and worsen vulnerability being counted as climate finance. But developing countries really are fully aware of rich countries' efforts to stuff this goal full of loans, corporate investment, foreign direct investment, carbon markets, de-risking, which is when public finance goes to help reduce the risk of giving loans, so that loan givers are more likely to give those loans. That's de-risking. That's considered to be part of the climate solution, but it's yet another drain on public funds, and it's yet another way to protect the profits of private companies. We shouldn't be including insurance, for example, as climate finance, because there's a lot of push now for private insurance companies to supposedly be the solution instead of loss and damage finance. Perhaps some of you will remember from a couple of years, the last few years, there's been a real push. In fact, it was before we won the establishment of the loss and damage fund that rich country was saying, no, you don't need a loss and damage fund. You just need insurance. And hey, our companies will help you. So, all of that could also be included theoretically included as climate finance. Of course, those insurance companies are the one that's going to be getting whatever public finance there is, right? So once again, that eats into the public finance pie, that real grant money pie. So we're seeing loans, corporate investment, foreign direct investment, carbon markets. Oh God, I haven't even touched on that one. Do you want me to? I'm not going to, sorry. I'll just trigger us all here. De-risking, insurance, grandpa's old socks, whatever, everything under the sun is going to be counted as this climate finance goal in order to minimize the amount of money, the amount of real grant-based finance. And it's all just being used as a substitute to mean that nobody, and blurred lines, so nobody really has to give any grant-based finance really, as long as we have every other thing under the planet being counted as climate finance. So yeah, we think that there needs to be a clear definitions, because this could get totally out of control. And it's actually really unclear what they mean in this text, what they mean by mobilization and what they mean by investment layer. I mean, some of us think we know what they mean by mobilization. Some of us think we know what they mean by investment layer. But I've found that talking to lots of different people have different assumptions of where that boundary actually is. I'm not going to nerd out about it now, don't worry. But everyone thinks they mean different things, and we just don't know what is meant. And that's actually really dangerous. Another thing is that we do know that rich countries are recounting aid. So double counting aid. and so it's not additional finance. We're not talking about we don't want a climate finance goal that doesn't raise new funds, but that just instead ticks existing money that's out there and says, well done, everyone, job done. That's not what this whole process is supposed to be about. If that's what we're doing, let's all just go home, God. So it gets even better though, right? Because we've been talking here about, the global South needing this money. Well, guess what? The US is actually pushing for the new climate finance goal to include money that it pays itself to do climate action. Yeah, seriously. So those guys are making the EU look good. That's how bad they are. It's getting ridiculous. So we have to also learn the lessons from even the $100 billion goal, as meager as that goal was. Everyone thought $100 billion, well, that sounds like something. Well, the Oxfam research shows that it was, in fact, in 2022, just between 28 and $35 billion a year in grant-based money went in climate finance out of that $100 billion goal. Well, how much is that? Let's say it's $35 billion that year. How much is it? Well, twice as much was spent that year in the global market of ice cream. The world spent twice as much on ice cream as it did on fixing the climate crisis that year. I feel like we're not really taking the climate crisis seriously. As much as we like ice cream, and there are some people in this room who I know really like ice cream, I think we also love a livable planet. So we need definitions because this is getting out of control. We need exclusions. We need not only do we need the quantity of the goal, we need the quality of the goal to be clear. And it needs to be clear who pays and who receives. Yeah.
Thank you, Teresa, for that. We all love ice cream, but we all need a livable planet. I think it's a very important point. And to be honest, talking to developed countries party who have been proposing this multi-layer investment layer, they don't know what they're talking about either. It's clear that they have different understandings. So I think it's a very strong argument as well to say your propositions are actually not mature enough to be even discussed here. And the other point you mentioned about having a clear definition, but also a clear exclusion list, I think are two key hooks that we need to exploit in the coming discussion next week, because saying what it is, but also what it shouldn't be is very important in the context of transparency of climate finance. Moving on to the next myth is the link with debt and climate justice and climate justice. So I think everybody thankfully now recognize that we face probably the worst debt crisis ever, hitting the global south very, very hard. However, if we agree on that situation, the solutions are far from being adequate. The majority of propositions to fix the debt crisis are actually not fixing anything. They are just, addressing tiny bits of it without addressing the problem at its core and its structure. So, Maria, I'd be keen to hear from you, because we know that debt swaps, debt suspension clauses, all those kind of, ad hoc instruments have been also proposed in the context of the NCQG and the climate finance negotiation. But what would be the real solution that we need to put forward in the context of the NCCC negotiation, but of course, looking also to other processes?
Thank you, Rebecca. Yes, debt swaps. The headline is that they are massive destruction. Debt swaps are but a drop in the ocean, and in some cases, they can be really, really harmful. I'm going to talk about, use some examples such as Seychelles in 2016, such as Ecuador and Belize, right? So they package them, right, as huge success stories. Well, they are not, I'm afraid. These resources, as I said, they are tiny in comparison to the needs. They actually, if countries didn't have enough money to pay back the loans, they're not going to have the money to really be investing in these development goals, in these climate and nature goals, right? So this is not enough. This is not providing enough funding. They come with hard conditionality, and we know what conditionality means. These tied up, conditions that are really at odds with participation, with the local knowledge and local needs. And they really go against participation from a human rights approach as well. And for instance, in the case of Belize, this debt for nature, they really affected fishers and their livelihood. They undermine transparency and access, particularly for local community. And again, there is a lot of profit being made who is able to provide, these packageable solutions. When I was saying that they can be really, really harmful, it's because they are very slow, they are burdensome, and they are very expensive as well, because they are very complex and they involve really lengthy negotiations. There are a lot of fees of intermediaries, again, those people who know how to do things and how to pocket part of it. And also they legitimize illegitimate debt, right? All these odious debt that should be like, we should refuse, well, the Global South should be refusing to pay, because remember that it is the Global North that owes up to the Global South. And a lot of these loans were made by dictators and they were actually spent on corruption, right? And now these people even have to pay again, right? So they are really distracting. They are really risky solutions. And they are also part of this like new shift and this new narrative of financialization, right? We heard this morning, there are 1,770 corporate lobbyists here at the COP. I hope none of them are here at the moment, right?
We don't know.
We don't know. Well, if you are and you have seen the light and you want to convert to our cause, please come and talk to us, okay? There is redemption, okay? And there are reparations as well to be paid, but there are like people. But we have had enough of all this, the risking, using public money for people to make a profit, okay? Enough is enough, really. All this packaging of what's investable, all this packaging of what looks good is really distracting us, it's really fragmenting, and it's really derailing us from what climate financing should be about. Remember, public grant base 1.3 trillion per year, okay? And there is enough money. Thank you.
Thank you for that. So I invite everyone to screen the future text and look for debt swaps and make those points really clear. Now you know all about it. And we actually have a very cool and short briefing about debt swaps. That's only 3 pages, 5 bullet points. So you can all be against debt swaps advocates. We kept the most juiciness for the end. We're going to give it to Harjeet, so that has a bit of a hard job to answer that. Harjeet, I heard that we need to expand the contributor base to have a good quantum. Is that true?
I think so. Okay. Before I go there, before I talk about the juicy stuff, speaking of fossil fuel lobbyists, I know at least one of them.
Here?
Day before, not here. Day before, I was actually put on an interview on TRT World with climate denier who was actually in that hall, and I had a big fight with him on that. So at least I know one of them. And because we have talked a lot about ice creams and definition, I'm going to give you a fun fact. Connected to that, in India, we have defined that anything which is made of vegetable oil is not an ice cream. It's now called as frozen dessert. So ice cream means real milk. So imagine a developing country has cracked the code of defining what is ice cream, and we are not able to define what is climate finance. It's a shame on them. So anyway, coming to contributor base, there was a big legal case, by the way, and I'm not lying. Just check Amul legal case, ice cream, dessert, you'll find it. Right, coming to contributor base, little more juicy stuff, as Rebecca says it. So I'm going to give you 3 reasons why the argument of adding more contributor base and that will increase finance really falls flat. First of all is a legal and moral part. When we talk about money as part of climate finance, it's to deal with the crisis that we are facing right now. And the current climate crisis is because of the historical emissions. So the historical responsibility of rich countries, or as we say, Annex II countries, is absolutely clear. It's about past emissions which have caused the crisis and not for the last 30 years. I'm not saying that those emissions are not going to cause problem. Absolutely. right? And we should talk about them, we should account them. But at this moment, we need to talk about historical emissions. And we also need to recognize that those countries that we are pointing fingers at have also done a lot of poverty elevation. When we speak of China, nobody talks about, and if you really listen to people who make sense, it's a miracle what China has done. I know not many people want to hear what I'm saying, but that's the reality, right? All developing countries, now talk about India. If India doesn't create jobs, how are we going to feed our own people? And that's true for Indonesia. That's true. There are no US and Europeans who are actually helping those countries reducing their poverty levels. They're doing it all on their own. And they have done it in the last 30 years. And now you're blaming them for the model that you gave. If somebody from the UK government comes to me as an Indian and says you're using coal, I'll say, do you know who gave us coal? The legacy of coal, your colonization of 200 years. So we are talking about history here. That's point number one. Second, if you want to have more money, there is already Article 9.2, which is voluntary contributions. They're going to, and we've already seen that, whether UAE on loss and damage, or we see Mexico giving to Green Climate Fund, it's happening. So countries who will be able to pay will pay. So you can't force them. We are talking about convention, we're talking about Paris Agreement. Developed countries are liable to pay. Third is the sequencing part of it. You're asking, unless and until China and Gulf countries, and you're including Singapore and India, unless they pay, you will not pay. The point is you have not paid your fair share yet. We are talking about historical emissions. Once you pay your fair share and then you say, now let's start accounting for emissions of the last 30 years because there's a crisis, you have an argument. Once you have paid up all your fair share, then whoever is next, be it China, be it Gulf states, be it India, be it Singapore, be it Nepal, everybody will come, but you first pay your fair share. You don't have any moral and legal argument now to get more countries to share the burden that you have left on us. You have not done your part yet. Thank you.
Thanks. And maybe just a small addition. We know also that developed countries have been repeatedly refusing to speak about burden sharing agreements. So now they want to bring new contributors in while never clarify their own fair share, as Agreed was saying. So yeah, we see really the strategies and the tactics there in that specific debate. So I hope this list of 9 myths helped you to navigate a bit better the different politics and what is at stake in the climate finance negotiation. You can see hopefully the different links, of course, with all those pieces and the, let's say, underlying strategy or delaying tactics, if you can call it like that, from the majority of developed countries. And so I think it's very important that we are clear about the situation and we are able to counter those different arguments to push for a deal that's really adequate for people and communities, because it's not only about the finance negotiation, right? And it's not only about NCQG, it's about the climate regime as a whole, about the future of the Paris Agreement. And we know that finance has implication in every single room here at COP29. So it's not only just about, being in a vacuum and focus only on that text and those specific points. It's about making the links with the wider politics and ensure that justice and responsibility are at the core of the conversation. So that being said, we have 20 minutes for you to ask any question, maybe to add about the myth you've been encountering, the different arguments you've been hearing. And yeah, please share with us a reflection or question. We have time for that now. Sir.
Thank you. My name is Aminul from Bangladesh. So you have said the burden sharing. Because we have seen the draft takes a lot of word, we make many explanations. Sharing means sharing between you and me and among the persons or among the countries. So why call it is burden sharing, burden taking? Because developed countries, they are polluter, they are polluting the country. Why you are not say the burden taking? You have to take the burden as you are pollute the climates and you have created the crisis, so that you have to take the burden of either finance or capacity building or everything. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Anybody else? Yes, sir.
Yeah, thank you for those very illuminating presentations, discussions. But it's quite clear to me from what the panel says that in fact, there is a general trend towards privatizing the climate response itself, moving it out of the public sphere, using all of these different mechanisms and so on. So my question is, what really can be done to ensure that in fact it actually stays a public policy issue rather than one that is, taken out of our control and given to the private sector, so to speak. Thank you.
Thank you for that question. We can take a few and then I'll let the panel answer. Yes.
Thank you so much for this panel. My name is Piera Tortora. I'm the head of the 4P Secretariat. This is the Paris Pact for People and the Planet. And we were created last year to accelerate the reform of the international financial system. So one key element is the reform of the governance, because as you said, there is a huge issue in terms of representation. But we're also working on some very concrete proposals, and you kind of tapped into many of these areas. Just next door, there is a discussion on global solidarity levies. So there is one idea in terms of taxing those sectors that are currently under-taxed, and the revenues from these taxes could actually be used for vulnerable countries and poor countries to accelerate the ecological transition. So this is one thing, global solidarity levies. A second thing, you mentioned private finance, and I think a huge issue there is that many of the rules, we talk about the enabling environment in developing countries, but we never talk about the global enabling environment, and the fact that many rules actually penalize investments in developing countries. For instance, Solvency II sets a criterion which is not at all risk-based, but is like OECD or non-OECD countries, which sets a completely different cost of capital at the end of the day. But in OECD countries, you have Colombia, you have very different countries, so it doesn't mean anything. So we're working now to set up an expert group of eminent people to push this forward. And the 4P is now endorsed by 68 countries at the heads of state level. So I think we can do something really to push these ideas forward. And we're also working on credit ratings because, as you mentioned, there is a huge issue there in terms of, first of all, enhancing the transparency of this credit ratings. Developing countries sometimes don't even know what they're being assessed against, but also the accuracy. So just this to say, I think, what you're doing is great. But we also need really to focus on the solutions. We need you, to work with you on the solutions. So I stand ready to be working with all of you and all of you in the room. 4P, very happy to continue the discussion, and thank you so much again for this panel.
Thank you very much for intervention. Also, I saw Sir there first, then we're gonna close this stack, and then I'll take you for the next one.
This is Praveen from Nepal, and thank you, first of all the four panelists for the excellent narratives on the climate finance, and that builds to the whole NCQG negotiations. My question is that since yesterday the whole COP29 seems to be at hold because of the NCQG text. So can you share some light insights on what the state of play on the NCQG currently, and what the CSOs, what we can do in terms of unlocking the situations that we have. So what should be our role on that? So maybe more insights on that. Thank you.
I'll let the panel react as it wants. So who wants to start? You want me to recap the question, or are you good?
No, I guess I wanted to react especially on that question related to global architecture reform and levies. Of course, we're looking at taxation as one of the main innovative sources, both in terms of tackling tax avoidance, tax evasions, and Maria was talking about the importance of the UN Tax Convention, which is on the way, but also on innovative sources such as making polluters pay, progressive taxation, taxing the rich, and levies could have a role. However, they have to be crafted in a way that they are just. So I understand, for example, the conversations about the maritime one last year failed because actually, from a justice perspective, for countries, there are large exporters of commodities, for example, that are really big in their economies, but also for small islands that depends on importing everything because of the nature, they could be impacted differently, and that has implication in terms of developing countries. So even when we're thinking levies, we have to think through the eyes of how they will impact. In the case of the aviation, for example, yeah, you can have like first class, business class, etc., pay more, or exempt economy or less of an economy. I think that there could be different ways to do that. But also there is a conversation to what extent is that implemented national level legislation, and what is the jurisdiction to put something global like this. So I think it has to be carefully crafted. And just in terms of the wider reform, the reviewing quotas, the quota system of MDBs in terms of governance is another thing that has to go hand in hand with that. Yeah, I'll leave the rest of the panel to comment. Thanks.
To the question about the state of play of negotiations, sorry, we've been on this panel, so I haven't seen the latest text. But Rebecca did outline the state of play. But to maybe put in a nutshell, this week they've been incrementally trying to, cut down a long, unwieldy, unstructured draft that includes all options, all views, all hopes, aspirations, but in, repetitive and confusing form, and, slowly shaving it down. A concern is that you cannot give a text that is, yesterday day before it was 34 pages, yesterday it was 33, maybe it'll be 32 today. You cannot give an unwieldy doc like that to ministers to decide on. So our concern is that we may see a scenario where ministers go, well, we can't look at this, so we'll just chat among ourselves in a small room with just 5 of us and draft it for you. We've seen that happen before, and this very incremental, confusing process that, that could happen again. So what we really need is this new doc to really make substantive progress with clear, succinct options, lots of clear definitions that make it easy to debate and decide. But then to the question about what can we really do to address privatization, I mean, I actually think if we were to get everything we hope for in the NCQG, like a goal in the trillions that is worth with grant-based finance, if we were to get debt cancellation, if we were to get tax justice, we wouldn't need to seed all of those grounds and all of those solutions to private industry. So it's in their interest for all of these other agendas to be very weak so they can present themselves as the new solution. So I guess my answer is no, nothing new, just keep fighting where we're fighting, because that's where the fights are.
Thank you. I'm going to merge a few questions here and hopefully provide some solutions here. And definitely, I mean, the international financial architecture is very much against the global south, is very much against the climate transition that we need. It's really not working. And although I'm new to the COP spaces, I've been following, all these like negotiations from the G20, etc. You were mentioning Colombia as being part of the OECD. Not all countries have the same weight in the OECD, right? And we have seen that a lot in the BEPS, for instance, and all this inclusive framework that for those that have not been following it was their attempt to actually undo a lot of the unequal tax negotiations that is leading to $500 billion loss every year in global tax abuse. After 10 years, they haven't got really there, and they are not going to get there. And when countries are invited to the table, as you were saying, like for Colombia and other countries, some of them are to be on the menu. And it is the same here. I see the same dynamics, right? Particularly the G7 countries. I'm not going to mention the different groups in here, but you see the rich countries always like making excuses not to owe up, you're right, like to what they really need to be paying. And they use excuses of every sense. And for instance, in the UN Tax Convention, it has been really the African countries pushing for it. And for me, this is one of the best moves towards decolonization and towards calling up what's happening in terms of how they cannot really, as you were saying, in terms of the changing the environment, they cannot even apply a progressive tax reform in their own countries because the IMF, because the World Bank is pushing for regressive solutions. I'll finish here. But yeah, and they're also pushing for privatization. So this is what we are seeing all the time. It's not even in the benefit of countries in the global north of the citizens. No, it's in the benefit of corporate lobbies everywhere.
Thank you. Before I take Harji to add something very quickly, can I just check who still has a question or comment in the room? So 2 people. Okay, that's fine. So okay, so we take you first and then we'll go back to the panel. Can we have a mic? You have it?
Yeah, I have it. Thank you so much. And thank you. It's always a pleasure to listen to you, all of you in different platforms. Just wanted to thank you. Many of the things you discussed, many of the proposals, they seem to be like, playing by the rule within the system. And you know that this system is dependent on, on imperialism, on neocolonialism, on extractivism. So could you give us 1, 2, 3 solutions that are disruptive of the existing system? Thank you.
Thank you very much for that very pertinent question. Sir, you're going to have the last word, at least the last question.
Hi, my name is Kundan Pandey. I'm a journalist. I write for Mongabe, India. Basically, after listening all experts, and I remember day before yesterday, UNFCCC, a standing committee, released 3 reports on climate finance. And there they had used this, the claim, OECD claim of $100 billion meeting target, like in 2022. When we raised the question about the grant and whatever we talked here, they said that Copenhagen Accord does not mention grant. What is our standing? What was the clear term and what is their point? And what are the conflicting position that way? And second, because even if CCC is raising or highlighting the OECD formula and saying that this much money has been flown to developing countries, do you think it embolden their stand that way?
Thank you. So we'll start with Harjit first, because you didn't have the opportunity to answer, and then we go back to the panelists for closing words.
Yeah, I want to go back to that state of play question that Praveen asked. We're also hearing from a couple of parties that the real conversation will start on Wednesday, when they will have a text, as Teresa was saying, that text will include numbers. So rich countries have not put a number, it's only developing countries. So the real negotiation will begin then, that's what we hear. To your question on what we can do, which is more transformative and channeling the status quo, I would say let's just walk out. We did that in Warsaw. And I'm not joking. I think we definitely need something far more hard-hitting. And as civil society, we need to take a bold move, but parties have to stand up. And I would put the onus on developing countries in this case, because we are adjusting a lot. And that's the reason we are so late. 30 years have passed. I think they should stand up and say enough is enough. And trust me, we have reached a point, and I totally agree with you. If you don't get a good deal here, we are gone. And I've been saying after Paris, this is the most important COP. If you don't get finance, trust me, why? And when there are people putting question marks on the process, they're right. Because, yeah, we got 200 countries together, common pathway. Yeah, we are not doing 1.5, it's 2.5, all direction. All that is going to fall apart. And then you can't talk about your ratcheting up mechanism. Report after report you hear, it's the conditional pledges. Developing countries have ambitious plans, they don't have money. And if you don't get money here, honestly, this process is going to lose its credibility. So I think we need to do something completely different, but it's developing countries. Somebody else can answer the question on grants. Okay, I can then say. So it can be very long, but we don't have time. We can probably talk later. So when the real finance conversation began, when the first time number was mentioned, it was very informal in one of the speeches. That's how Obama and Hillary Clinton talked about $100 billion, and it came from a World Bank report. And the word that they landed was mobilize. And that's what they are sticking to. But of course, that time when you are responding to speeches, it was not a negotiated deal. And $30 billion itself was what was decided in 2009 at Fast Start Finance. Details started emerging later. And that's where developing countries emphasized how it's going to be grant. Of course, developed countries would like to stick to that word mobilization, which came in 2009, but we can't get stuck there. And that's why we are continuing to define what public finance is. And that's what the whole argument and discussion about the definition of it, which rich countries don't want to have. So it's a bit historical, but it doesn't respond to the climate justice argument.
Thank you. Looking to the panel if there is any final addition you want to make. Short one.
Going to be so quick that it's written, and I'm really happy to share it when you were talking about some solutions that could disrupt. So yeah.
Great. With that, we'll slowly come to a close. I invite everyone, actually, if you also want to do something about the situation, to join us right now outside of this room to the Fossil of the Day ceremony that you may have heard of, where we actually every day give an award to the worst player of the negotiation. So I won't say who it is today. You have to go to know that, but it has very, very deep links with all what we've been discussing today in this event. So I invite you to follow the conversation there. And yeah, just to add, thank you so much for that discussion. Thank you to our amazing panelists. I hope this helped you to know what to do, what to follow in the coming weeks. NCQG is at the heart of the conversation this year at this COP, and you know what we really need to fight for. Public finance at the core of the NCQG, grant-based, transparent climate finance. That's really key, and don't let you fooled or distracted by other propositions. Thank you.